Here.
Dyke.
Here.
Freund. Here. Mack.
Here.
Maycumber. Here. Annette. Here.
Thank you. Agenda item 2 is reading of the district mission statement by Director Maycumber.
Our mission is to engage, inspire, and empower students and staff in order to maximize learning.
Thank you. Agenda item 3 is approval of the agenda. Is there any additions or corrections?
No.
Is there a motion?
Move to approve the agenda as published.
I'll second that.
Motion and second to approve the agenda as published. Roll call vote, please.
Dyke.
Yes.
Freund. Yes. Mack.
Yes.
Maycumber.
Yes.
Walker.
Yes. Motion carries 5-0. Agenda item 4 is welcome the visitors and accept public comment. Tonight we'll take public comment if there's any that is not associated with any of the agenda items. Are there any comments that, nothing? Excellent. Moving on, we'll go to agenda item number 5, high school modernization Phase 2 design presentation.
All right, we have Gene Underwood from BLDD Architects here. And we're going to project it up on the wall. Yeah.
Hello,
I don't know if
everyone.
it's turned on. Okay.
All right, so tonight I brought with me a plan of a schematic plan of the new high school. So this is a little bit different than what you've seen in the past due to one really critical factor. We were told that there is the possibility that students could be relocated from this building into the old middle school, 500, is it 500?
North Grand
building.
Yep.
Which would allow us to demolish all 3 circles, that entire section of building at one time, so that we could build on top of that location rather than trying to use some of them while we're doing construction, phasing things in, those kinds of things. So that what that does is a couple different things. It allows us to have the new high school addition built right over the top, which brings them to the front of the site, which puts them in kind of that prominent position. It improves circulation. It allows for some really great adjacencies between an auditorium, the gymnasium, some common spaces are able to be shared. So I can walk you through this plan, but the reason this is so different is because of that one key point. And so the ability to relocate students during construction shortens the construction time and makes things a lot easier. And there are some economic benefits as well to not having to do portable classrooms and those kinds of things. And so that's why this is a little rougher than I would have liked to have brought tonight. But let's take a look at it. On the first floor plan, and I apologize, there's a little bit of a glare here from my side, so I'm going to look at this sketch as well. At the, oh, thank you. So at the upper left, you will see an entry element, which is basically in the same location as your current high school entry. And so we would look at expanding that commons cafeteria space that you have into a larger commons cafeteria type area. That serves as kind of the gathering point for auditorium performances, activities that are going on in that gym that's right there, and serves as the high school commons. So this allows you to separate middle school and high school functions for the most part throughout most of the day. You'll see that the middle school is kind of an L shape, a reverse L shape. The high school is kind of a block L shape that kind of fits in with it. But for the most part, they're separated. And that was something that we heard going through the whole process that was desired. So as you come in those front doors, it's a secure entry sequence with your administration offices. Right there, you'll see those in kind of that bright yellow. If you go down, you'll see a blue rectangle. That would be the kitchen area, and so serving goes right into that common space. It's really convenient for serving for students. It's very similar to what you have now. You do have the opportunity to just remodel the kitchen that you have as it is, if you would like to do that as well, rather than building a new kitchen. So you have some options when it comes to that. Otherwise, I would anticipate the existing kitchen being repurposed and renovated for the culinary and FCS program perhaps, which we felt like was a really great area to do that. So you have a couple options with that. Moving to the right, what you see in kind of the pink color would be the music, choir, band, orchestra, and performance functions. And so there's a suite of music spaces with music commons kind of in the center. That music commons is similar to what we saw a couple different schools that we've toured. So your practice rooms would be off of that commons, instrument storage, music storage, all those kinds of things. The theater itself would have main level and mezzanine seating. So it would have a first and a second level. That keeps the footprint pretty compact for us and takes advantage of that location. So you can see that there would be access from the backstage into the music suite of spaces. So you can go directly onto the backstage, which is really convenient. Just to the top, you'll see a collection of green and orange boxes. In the center of those would be the high school information commons or library function. And so that library function would be a 2-story space with the classrooms around it. On the first floor, the green spaces would be more of a lab, art, maker spaces, those kinds of things. So kind of a horseshoe of those. Across from those in the orange would be more typical classroom spaces or learning environments. So they're labeled, I think, as learning studios, not studio in the concept that we have at the middle school, just that they're not a traditional classroom per se. They're more of a different learning environment. So that's just a semantics kind of thing. So don't take that meaning any differently than what it's intended. Up above, I'm going to quickly just go to the second floor. Well, you know what? We'll stay on the first floor for a minute. You can see a connection in the yellow. That's the circulation, so corridors, hallways, connecting the high school suite over to the north wing, the existing north wing, for access into that space. What that connection does is it allows us to have some of those high school functions be in that north wing, the existing north wing. I'm not showing a lot of renovation in that area right now, but I would anticipate that we would probably need to put some high school functions in that area. If for some reason we don't decide to do that, it certainly leaves you room to relocate district offices, to have something like Iowa Big North in that area, alternative school. There's a lot of different things you could do with that space in the future. If we're building more new space, we can do less renovated space and vice versa. So if we feel like we don't want to build as much new space, we can certainly put some of those high school functions in that north wing. They're still very close to that. It also still allows us to expand some of the middle school into those spaces. Like we talked about during that phase, future development in this area to support some of the middle school needs. And so that's certainly still on the table and a part of the plan. One thing that you'll also see down towards the bottom, attached to the existing middle school, is a blue box labeled kitchen. We felt like the location of the high school kitchen really made a lot of sense, but it still left us with the problem of getting food from that kitchen to the middle school serving areas. So we've included an option to add a second prep kitchen that would support the middle school serving areas that you see in that blue box. And so you're doubling up your kitchen space a little bit, but you're allowing the rest of the circulation and the rest of the classes, the rest of the departments to really function really, really nicely. So it's, 10 cents that's going to gain you $1 kind of investment. So that's certainly an option. You would still have the option to cart food from that high school kitchen if you wanted to. So that's something we can talk about. The last thing that I want to talk about on this plan for right now is you can see that there is kind of a corridor going along the top side of the existing performance gym. That allows you to have some connection between the middle school commons and the high school commons. Granted, they're not super close, but this is what we have to deal with. So this is kind of the shortest path between those 2 points, which would allow you to have two athletic functions at the same time and still have a connection between those two. The other thing this does is allows middle school students access to all those music spaces during their regular day. So their travel distance has really been reduced by putting the music and the auditorium kind of in the center of the building. Next to that, you'll see in the middle a large outdoor classroom area. So that's a very large courtyard space that can be used for a lot of different things, whether it's a suite of outdoor classrooms. It's actually large enough you could do PE out there you know, a lot of different things. It's completely contained, so security is not a concern, which is really nice to have that large of an outdoor space. Couple other minor points, loading docks and loading areas. You'll see a kitchen loading noted as well as a music program loading, so access for large trucks and that kind of thing to be able to get close, load things out, you know, instruments and those kinds of things can be a challenge. Also, access for down the corridor to the middle school kitchen if that kitchen is built. It's not quite as convenient, but it's still fairly close. All right, let's jump to the second page, which is the second level. So on this floor, pretty much the only second story space for the high school addition is going to be a continuation of your core curriculum classes, kind of in that horseshoe shape up above the two-story information commons. And so we would see these more as more of your core curriculum type classes, although it certainly could be other things depending on where we land with the building program as far as labs and maker spaces and those kinds of things. So for now, we're showing it just kind of this horseshoe shape. You'll also see you have access to the second floor seating of the theater. And so we're showing kind of seating in the round and not above the stage, but kind of a U-shaped or horseshoe-shaped up there. There'll obviously be elevator over in this area as well, which I know is something that we had talked about, trying to share that middle school elevator. The circulation and the relationships just were really a struggle to make that happen. So much like the second kitchen, a second elevator, while you will be paying for that up front, it allows for a lot smoother function of all of the different departments eventually. What kind of questions does everybody have?
Comments, guys, questions?
I guess one of the questions I have is, you had mentioned that there is some cost savings if we were to be able to do the renovations all at once.
Mm-hmm.
Would that also include decreasing the amount of time it takes to complete the project?
I think that's certainly possible. I would want to talk to Estes Construction about that, but typically if you're not having to kind of phase your construction around things, it's always going to be easier and faster to just come in, hit it hard, have access to everything you need access to all at one time. I couldn't tell you if that's 2 months, 3 months, 4 months.
Sure.
But yeah, there's certainly going to be some benefit to that.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have a long ways to go with this plan,
Yeah.
but my list of things that I had concern with the other plan are all addressed in this plan.
Mm-hmm.
So I really don't have any questions. I just want to see it continue to develop. It puts the front entrance where I'd like to see the front entrance be again. This outdoor classroom area that's secure, you know, we've seen those as maker spaces. It's awesome to have, excellent, that will be a well-used space. It's something we need. The being able to use our existing parking that's now at the front of the high school is huge. Also, putting the music area, I feel, in the center between the middle school and the high school
Yeah.
makes lots of sense.
Mm-hmm.
I like the way that initially the way the art is set up across from some core classes for collaboration, some more combined experience between those departments.
Excellent. Missy?
I think it looks great, yeah. I don't really have a whole lot of questions myself either. You know, I think everything that you guys have included in this is, you know, going to be beneficial, so.
Out of all the plans that, I don't want to say plans, options that we looked at last spring,
Mm-hmm.
and they keep being refined and condensed, and we keep getting more and more input from faculty, et cetera. I'm going to agree, I like this probably the best, and, you know, I don't think we need anything more detailed, because we've got the maker spaces and the design process going on
Right.
at the other end of this building, that we continue to utilize and gain input from staff on. And that will continue throughout the rest of this year, so,
Absolutely.
you know, to have details of where's this English room going, that's a long ways away.
Right, right. We still certainly want people to understand that there's still a lot of input to be put into this plan. Obviously, we will hardline this and have some, some pretty pictures and those kinds of things, but it will still be, this is where core curriculum is, this is where lab maker space is. It won't be any more specific than that.
But by having your first floor, your music area in where you've got it, we can still see the new gym above that. Your line of sight with the windows from the new middle school still stay.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, it's the best one. It's the best option I've seen so far.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
And I'll say that, like, what Scott's saying is the options we saw before, I felt that we were making substantial concessions in the product we were gonna get simply to be sure that we can operate the building when construction was going on. And when we're talking about, the building that's gonna serve our community for the next 50, 75, 100 years, 1 or 2 years' time there up front of inconvenience, shouldn't be, we shouldn't make such serious concessions, in my opinion, as to what I was seeing on the other plans. This layout and the footprint on the property like this makes so much more sense than what we had seen before. And like you'd noted with options that we're starting to see and look at more so with the building that we have at our disposal for that process. I really like this, and again, like you said, continued refinement of programming with the staff. The functionality of how things are gonna work, we continue to refine that as construction was going on with this, so I expect
Right.
that in this process too, but generally here, this is far and away better than what we had seen before, in my opinion. I like where we're at now.
Excellent.
Ballpark cost. I know that's a continuing
Well, the budget is
refinement.
22
so
million.
the budget is 22 million. I wanted to make sure that was out there so that
The
we're.
budget is 22 million. I think as this is drawn right now, I think I'm not entirely comfortable that exactly what I have shown here is gonna hit that.
Mhm.
We do have some decisions and some options that we can, to implement to make
Yeah.
that happen. But I certainly don't wanna make those decisions for you without getting some of your input.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're to the point though, we have a general layout that'll work. It's whether or not, do we include that second corridor on the right of the
Yeah.
theater? Can we trim that square footage? Can we shift some of the high school, more traditional classroom spaces over to that north wing possibly? I think we have some options to move some stuff around, to do less renovation in some areas and more renovation in other areas, and kind of work through those details. Right now, I don't think we have the budget to do a full fly loft plus all the music spaces that have been asked for. And there's some things that I don't think we can do within the budget that we have right now. There's certainly options for phasing. If there's private fundraising that's done and we can stretch the budget a little bit, there's a lot of different variables out there. So, we'll keep working through that with you till we get to a point knowing that the budget is the budget.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm confident of that. Great middle school, so good.
The purpose is to modernize the high school, and this would be a modernization of the high school. This is not over the top by any means. This is not excessive. This is what you do to your house at home. You've got some spaces that you need to update, and this does that. Unlike the board members, I like the last design that I saw 10 times better than I like this one.
Okay.
But I don't know if they've seen that one. So I differ in that respect. But I did start with, this does hit the mark of what we're trying to do. I do have some questions as we kind of flesh this out. So the entryway to the high school appears, because of the two-dimensional drawing that we're looking at, really understated compared to the statement that the middle school entrance makes when you come up to it. Can you address that?
Well, I think at this point, it is really just a 2D, this is where the entrance is going, not a reflection of what that looks like in appearance. Because I know when the last design that we showed you a few weeks ago was in 3 dimensions, and so it was a lot easier to visualize what that's going to look like. I think we can make that entry as much of a statement as you would like, and kind of adjust that level, ramp it up at the entry, ramp it down on the backside, you know, to kind of hit those marks.
What I've heard from board members over the past 4.5 years is, as people come up Salisbury, I don't want that 1961 gym to be the dominant feature. So how does this become a more dominant feature than
Right.
that as you look at it?
And I think we'll certainly take the architecture of the middle school and, you know, develop that on the Salisbury side of the high school so that you are seeing that. There's always opportunity to reface, you know, the existing gym so that as you're coming up Salisbury, you're seeing a completely modernized facade. Whether or not that happens right now or if it happens in a few years, you know, as more monies become available, we can work through what the options are for that.
There are a lot of squares in the yellow area in the administrative support, so I'm curious what you're intending to go in that space.
Well, and we put together a building program based on what we anticipated you would need in those spaces. And so that's still totally needs to be fleshed out with you, with your
Like,
staff.
Is that where counselors are located in addition to administrators and AEA staff? Are there spaces that central office might occupy? Because we've talked about the need to move central office. Is that reflected anywhere in this design?
I don't think
Or
central
not?
office is reflected in this design, but I think that office admin space does include counseling and all of those functions. You know, we certainly have opportunities to shift some of those to other locations so that guidance is not in that main office, so it's more accessible to students. This is more to get all the program square footage shown somewhere in the plan, and then we can kind of shift pieces as we need to. We know we're gonna have an office suite up there, so we have the secure entry sequence, but what's in that office, whether part of it is located elsewhere, is still on the table.
On the south part, kind of where the BLDD logo is and where it says first floor plan, those are roughly the locations of the large parking lot and then the new parking lot that have approximately 90 and 60 parking spaces between the two. One of the concerns on this one that I have is the previous design that I've seen, that the high school principal has seen, brought more parking closer to the Comet Gym area. So for people who don't get a spot in one of the two east side lots that are going to park in the current high school lot, it's a long hike to get all the way
Right.
through the building to Comet Gym.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes, it is. We can look at developing a site plan. I didn't know if that's something you want, you know, as we get closer to the referendum, as part of,
But isn't
Floor
that
plans in
something that we
addition.
could do as alternatives down the road too, if they develop a site plan? I mean, because what it comes down to too is, like you said, we're looking at a high school modernization.
Right.
And we have a limited budget. And yes, parking it is essential, but I think we have to focus on what it is we're trying to do here. And we know that in the future, we can take care of some of those, as inconvenient as it is right now, we may have to just wait till the future and just focus on this classroom space, this auditorium, this common space first, and then the rest of it.
well, I think Dan has a good point, though. In the future, where would it go? Is there a place for it and how many spots? So we can take a look at that.
The auditorium is squarely in the center of all of this. Previous design had its own entry, more accessible, is how I looked at it. And so I look at this and I just ask the question, do we want to put our auditorium in the center of a building that people are going to have to trek to one way or another to get to? That right now a budget says that's where it needs to go, and in 5 years we say, I really wish we would have put it someplace else to make it more accessible, rather than we did it as cheaply as we could. So that's a question that I have, and I see some heads nodding over there. From an administrative supervision standpoint, I do love the connection, so thank you for connecting Comet Gym to the 1961 high school gym. I also see places where people can hide out of the way, and it makes it tougher to supervise if we do have an event, AAU tournament, or even our own type of event where both gyms are in action. And
Right.
how do we secure off, given the numbers of hallways, and maybe it is eliminating the one next to the outdoor space, but if they're both there, how do we make sure we have a secure passage for people to get from one place to another?
Right.
That bad behavior doesn't happen.
I can never
Because-
guarantee no bad behavior, but we can certainly use passive strategies
create-
to prevent
yeah.
that. Yes, absolutely.
And I get what you're saying about the auditorium, but I think in previous ones, I'd been concerned about access to lobby-type space too, where with its positioning, and this would maybe address some of that more so with the student commons area outside of there and being able to have events, in both places, not sharing the common space like we'd seen once before. This being a little bit
Yeah.
more accommodating to that scenario.
And not putting,
Good.
Plus, by doing a two-story for your educational spaces, it would seem appropriate to me to have it where you've got it in this plan, because then I've got line of sight out multiple directions. If I'd move the two-story down to where you've got the music wing, now my second story of the high school is looking into the windows of the second story of the middle school. So if you do 2 stories, you also have to look at where are the windows in my line of sight. Because as I'm sitting here thinking about what Dr. Cox is saying, I'm thinking, well, just switch these 2 areas around, but then my line of sight for windows isn't necessarily appropriate. So, yeah, it's a,
The 6 green rectangles adjacent to the open to above will look down into that high school information commons, or what's the
I would
concept
anticipate
of
that. I would anticipate that, yes, would be the case, that there'd be a strong connection between the information commons type library function and those maker spaces.
my question would be too, though, just because you've got rectangles drawn here, doesn't necessarily mean that the rooms will be rectangular,
Correct.
does it?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, no, the size and shapes of the room are going to be informed by all the prototyping we're doing, exemplar tours that staff and administration goes on, those kinds of things. So, like I said, for now, these are just representations of the square footage that we need for those types of programs.
Okay. No, I get that. I'm just asking the question so other people
Yes.
can get that as well.
Thank you. Anything further? Yeah, at this time, I'll ask if there is anyone that wishes to make public comment specific to this agenda item. I'll remind everyone that the policies and procedures outlined for agenda item 4 also apply here, and then your comments will be limited to 2 minutes. So, does anyone wish to make public comment about this specific agenda item? Okay, seeing none. Oh, yeah,
please, we'd like to hear,
yeah,
please.
absolutely.
Well, I really like looking at the plans and seeing all the things that we visited kind of implemented. Some questions that arose from our table just were approximately looking at what you have envisioned here for an auditorium, how many seats that would perhaps be. I know it's not written in stone where we are with that by any means, but that is one of our questions, along with practice rooms and actual rehearsal classrooms with all of our different groups. So.
So the estimated seating in the auditorium is in the 600 to 650 range is what we've been planning for. As far as all the different music practice spaces, we're showing 5 music practice spaces, which is I think what you guys had requested. Rehearsal spaces, and then all the accessory spaces that go with that, storage, offices, instrument storage, all those kinds of spaces.
And practice rooms are in there with that suite as well.
Mhm. It's a magic sketch. Just gotta visualize it. Yep.
Lorraine Wintering. I have a question, and more so maybe a comment. You know, when we built the middle school, we knew the cart was before the horse in some things. And now that everything will be fit together, I just want to ask if the board or Dr. Cox, if there's any changes on the horizon for curriculum for middle school students, for art, for music, for family consumer science shop, any of those things, and how that relates to traffic from the middle school to those places. You know, we know that you said, you know, all those things have not been outlined here, and we'll get there. But I'm just wondering, you know, with the theater right there in the middle and music, and that outdoor classroom is great, but it's really prime real estate, given the way the two buildings fit together. Is there a better way to do that, or relocate that outdoor classroom so that our middle school students, if they're going to get more of those classes, how do they get to them quicker, easier? So I really don't have anything to tell you. I just have a lot of questions for you.
Good. I think we all do too, obviously, in similar things. I know there's issues with that we've had arise throughout the implementation and occupation of the new middle school. And like Gina talked about, opportunities possibly in the north wing of expanding stuff from the new middle school into that area if there's no longer a need for some of that space. So hopefully maybe we have some opportunities there too with doing something with that. A formal connection between even the commons area of the middle school and the industrial tech wing, I would hope, would make it possible to, you know, get students back and forth much easier than it currently is with going all the way out and around. So hopefully further refinement of that stuff will help with some of those questions.
Well, that is the loading area for your kitchen.
Yeah.
Sure,
So you really can't
but I would
get
expect that you have some sort of way to get around there and, you know, on the, what would be the west, the top side of that loading area.
There, yeah.
Yeah. So,
Right, so I think some of it comes down to how you want to run your programs. Do you want middle school and high school sharing spaces? And does your scheduling allow that to happen? So that there are times when middle school is using particular classrooms or spaces, and that high school is not? Or is there enough overlap that you need middle school, you know, particular spaces for some of those programs? And if so, probably the primary to do that would be in that existing north wing to develop some of those spaces there. So I think it's really a question for the district. How do we run it? How do we see those programs operating? Are they operating as one, or are they operating as two separate? If they're operating as two separate, you know, the adjacencies of some of those spaces, especially like the CTE kind of zone, which is pretty far away, becomes a moot point. So it just depends on how you want to operate your programs.
Sure.
It's a 2-minute walk
Yeah.
from the middle school area to get to that new spot that you've got. We're not talking about a half-mile trek. It's a short distance. It's no different than going from the 1932 section down the hallway to the art room like they did at the North Grand Building.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
It's not ideal, but it's not unworkable.
Well, and there's things we can do along that corridor. We still have the fitness trail information and things that can be added there, and it could be an interesting hike across there that would be beneficial, so.
More comments?
Oh,
I just kind of wanted to echo what Dr. Cox said. With that auditorium being landlocked like that, I think a couple of concerns for the theater department might be loading set pieces. You know, you saw some things that we loaded this year for set, even through the doors that we currently have, was very, very tight. It had to be dismantled and re-put together. And so I think going forward, that's something to be thinking about. And also, is there access to shop space along with that? As we become, you know, more elaborate, doing a musical every year, and that becoming a very important part of our program, that being something that we consider. And also just, you know, in the past couple of weeks, we've had just absolutely packed houses at concerts. And it's getting to the point now where we are going to be, where we can't cut them down any smaller than they already cut down grade-wise. So I mean, I think that's something we just have to think about, going forward, considering how many seats we're going to have in that auditorium and being able to serve the parents of the students that we have.
Thank you.
Yeah, you couldn't have a joint concert like you did last night. It would have to be,
phased out.
it would have to be a middle school and a high school because we couldn't fit last night.
The main mission of our concert last night.
You gotta come back to the mic.
The main mission for us of our concert last night is that our junior high program sees our high school program. And so part of that is we think it's very important to seat them in there so they actually get to see where they're going to be and to see where they have to go and what they have to look forward to in the music program. And the same goes for our high school students to see our junior high performers perform and to encourage them and to support them. And so, like you said, we won't have that opportunity. That will not fit the mission of what we're doing.
Or they'd have to get a simulcast out in the commons area.
Right.
So that the parents could be in the seats instead. I mean,
Yeah, which I think we'd
There
have
would
an
be some
uproar.
trade-offs.
I think we would have an uproar,
we
but,
also
you know.
have to caution on the side, here I am again, with our budget, if we're looking at an event, and I understand it, because I wish we could do it all, but if we're looking at an event that happens once a year, how many things do we take away from the daily activities to accommodate an event once a year? Idealistic, I wish we could give you a 1,200 seat auditorium.
Right.
I mean, I wish we could, but
Well, I-
realistically, and will we have regrets? Of course we're gonna have regrets, because we don't have $40 million to spend on this facility. So we can't even say, don't build something now you might regret later, because there just is going to be. We don't have enough money not to build something that we're gonna have some of that.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One thing I would suggest, as you're looking at the orientation of the auditorium here, the back of the seating is to the common side. There are certainly opportunities to make that back wall operable so that you can expand your auditorium out into the common space.
Knoxville, is that the,
Such as
in
at
Illinois?
Knoxville High School. So there are some opportunities to be able to expand it for particular occasions. Yes, those are not going to be the best seats in the house, but for once a year, that may be a solution that's palatable, that meets your needs.
And we've not been to Knoxville yet, but that might be on the list here for January,
Right, yeah. I would recommend
as we
that.
work through some of these things.
Excellent. Any further discussion by the board? Well, thank you, Jean. We
You're welcome.
appreciate everything. We appreciate
Yep,
this and continue to look forward to the further refinements in this
Alright,
process.
great, thank you.
Moving on to agenda item number 6 is the design financing. Really,
Matt Gillespie here from Piper Jaffray, who will tell us now about the money side of this.
Yes, this is where it gets exciting. Or I may put you to sleep, we'll see.
I've got one already.
Okay.
I know.
Well, good evening. I think I have now met you all at one time or another, but my name is Matt Gillespie from Piper Jaffray in Des Moines. And what we see in this packet is going to be up on the screen, so those of you that do not have the printed packet can see it. We're going to skip past the first few pages. I don't know that we really need to talk about your existing debt tonight. You can definitely ask questions about it if you want to. But if we go past the first section and go all the way to the portion that says school bond election cycle, so it's probably about 10 pages in. And again, we can go back to any of the prior ones if you guys want to ask questions for sure. That school bond election cycle, there's about 4 pages, and I'm not going to go through that, but that really is just giving the board and community information about how does a bond issue work, what are the timing requirements. There's going to be a committee, there's a petition process, certain dates that need to be met. So you can look through that, but before we go to the actual estimates of borrowing, I do want to talk about one thing on that very first page, school bond election cycle. If you're contemplating beginning a project in the spring or summer of 2019, and I'm not sure exactly when you're contemplating it, but if that were the case, looking at those dates towards the top of the page, you can see under the section that says now through July 1, 2019, there are even years and odd years. So of course 2018 is going to be an even year. You cannot vote the first Tuesday of February. It's obviously too late for that, and you're not ready to do that anyway. You could technically vote in April, just a few months from now. But my point being, if you go down to the odd years, which would be 2019, if you want to have 2 opportunities to vote, in case the first opportunity fails, and still be able to meet a summer of 2019 schedule, that means that the very last opportunity you could have would be that first Tuesday of April in 2019. And because you have to wait no less than 6 months after an attempt, if it does fail, that means that the first attempt would have to be the second Tuesday of September of 2018. If you had it the first Tuesday of December, that'd be perfectly fine as long as it passes. But if it didn't pass, you'd have to wait 6 months, would then be into June, which is past your fiscal year, your budget cycle. So you couldn't get bonds issued in the spring of 19 because you wouldn't have been able to levy taxes for it. So just keep that in mind as far as a timeline. And if you go beyond those 4 pages, we're going to come to a section that says, the title says sales tax revenue bonds. There are 2 estimates in here. They both say the same thing, which is you can't borrow any money from sales tax. But I do want to go through it because it's important for you to understand, especially if the sales tax were to be extended. Because you're in the same position whether it's extended or not, at least currently, and most schools don't understand that. And by that I mean schools that have debt. So on the first page, in the top right corner, it says sales tax revenue bonds, and there's some kind of fat arrows that point down along the right side. What you see here, and we're just concentrating on the right side, everything on the left says 0. On the right side, in that square box that has $1,426,000, that's the current estimate of your annual revenue using your October 2017 enrollment count and the fiscal year 18 per student count, per student revenue number. If you were to borrow before August 15th of next year, those are the 2 numbers we have to use. We can't use the October of 16 count, we can't use a projected October of 18 count, etc. So if your total revenue is $1,426,000, which we certainly don't know that today, but it's very close, it's very reasonable to assume it, and you see on the left of that, the left-sided fat arrow, your actual payments that you already have, $1.223 million, roughly $1.2 million, that was to fund obviously the middle school. You see then on the far right arrow that if you divide the $1.42 million by the $1.22 million number, you get a number that's around 1.16. So what that tells us is that you have $1.16 in revenue coming in for every dollar that you owe. And for those of you that have been on the board long enough as to when you sold the first bonds, you will hopefully remember that the board agreed to, which every board in Iowa, this is not unique to Charles City, you agreed to not issue more bonds unless I could prove that that number was at least 1.2. So unfortunately, what's happened since you issued the bonds for the middle school is that your enrollment has declined enough that it's now dragging that number below 1.2. So you can't issue more bonds from sales tax right now, even if you wanted to. Now, technically you could, because you could issue subordinate bonds, which would be like a second lien on your house, but you're not going to do that, so we're not even going to talk about that. So does that make sense, first of all, why you can't borrow more money right now? Because your payments that you have now are consuming not all of your sales tax, so it's still okay. You're not in any danger. You just can't go out and pile more debt on top of it right now. Going to the next page, you're going to see almost the same thing, but now on this page, this assumes that the sales tax has been extended and that you can then borrow for 20 years. Now, we don't know if the sales tax is going to be extended, and we don't know in what form it would be extended if it is. But my presumption is that, first of all, I do think it's going to be extended. I think it's going to be extended this session. That's what I've been hearing from not only not legislators specifically, but lobbyists and other people that are working with the legislators. Now, that may not happen, of course. It's just an assumption. But the other assumption that I make is that even if the legislature were to extend it, let's say for 30 or 40 years, you wouldn't be able to borrow for a 30 or 40-year period of time. I believe that the legislature would probably limit your borrowing to not more than 20 years because that's what your general obligation bond limit is. Now, even if you could borrow for 30 or 40 years, I don't know who in the hell would lend you money, excuse me, for that long of a period of time based off of nothing but enrollment. I mean, in any school district in the state, it's just so uncertain what someone's enrollment will be. They'd be taking an incredible risk. You'd be paying an enormous amount of interest. So I just don't think a school board would be prudent to do it anyway. So this shows you perhaps a 20-year repayment schedule, but of course there isn't a repayment schedule because even if the tax is extended, the payments that you have right now versus the revenue you have right now are still in the 1.16 number. So the extension of the tax doesn't do anything to allow you to borrow more money today. It's a great thing. If the tax gets extended, it's going to help every school in the state over the next 20, 30, 40 years, whatever that might be. But for those districts like you, which is a lot of districts who have borrowed basically to the limit on the sales tax side, it's not going to open up any new magical borrowing capacity. And I don't think most schools understand that. And it's because of this 1.2 calculation. So does that make sense?
Yep.
So that pretty much cuts out your ability to borrow more from sales tax. Now, as your revenue grows, which we hope it does over time, and that $1.426 million number eventually gets to 1.5 and then maybe 1.6, then all of a sudden within the $1.20 or that 1.2 calculation, there'll be more capacity. So it's not that you can't ever borrow again, it's just that you can't borrow right now in the situation that you're in at this moment. So then we go to general obligation bonds. So general obligation bonds, or GO bonds, require a vote, and generally speaking are going to require some property tax increase. There are some schools that have so much sales tax that they can actually issue general obligation bonds that require a tax levy, but then use sales tax to offset the levy, or what we call abating the levy, so that maybe your patrons pay nothing or pay a very minimal amount. Again, you don't have extra sales tax laying around that you're not already committing, so that's not going to happen here either, at least not in the short term. So any type of bond that you might issue is going to require a property tax increase. Now, it doesn't say any of this on this page, but does that mean that if you have a $2.70 bond, people's taxes are absolutely going to go up $2.70? No. Because in any given year, the school board has a little bit of flexibility in that you can decrease your management fund asking, you can decrease your cash reserve asking, you can increase income surtax percentage. All of those things have the effect of decreasing your tax levy. So you might be able to just, for a random example, say you could decrease one of those things by $1. So if the bond goes up by $2.70 and another levy goes down by $1, it's really a net $1.70 increase. So that could be a way that the board and the community thinks about it, if that's possible. And I haven't really talked to Terry about that possibility, but there's probably some flexibility to do it, but whether it's a significant amount, you'd have to determine at some later point. So looking at this first page beyond that little cover sheet, we see the example of a $2.70 bond issue. So you see in the far right column, the yellow column where that big fat arrow is pointing down, that this particular borrowing estimate would require a $2.70 or very close to that tax levy in order to repay the bonds. These bonds are repaid over 20 years, which is the maximum term. I am in the top right corner. You can't quite see it on that page up on the screen, but the printed copy you can. What I've done is I've assumed that your property taxes, that your property valuation would grow by 2% annually over the next 2 years, because we know what your January 2016 property value is. We don't quite yet know what your 2017 value is. We're always a year behind at that. So we'll know the January 2017 value right around January of 2018. But because I don't know that, I've just presumed that it would grow by 2%, and then it would grow by 2% the next year. So that by the time we get to the spring of 2019, when you'd be taxing for fiscal year 20, we would then have the 2018 valuation that had grown by 2% 2 times.
Mr. Gillespie, can I ask a question really quick?
Yes.
That 2%, did you choose that arbitrarily?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's 99% arbitrarily. I've looked at your history. Your history is not 7%,
Right.
but it's also not 0%. year history is kind of in the 1.5% to 4% range, so I could have arbitrarily chosen something else. So it's not wildly chosen, but it's also not any exact science that says that's is why I chose it. And lots of things can affect it. First off, if you got windmills in your district that came online, it's going to affect that immensely. School districts, not probably as large as Charles City, but more rural districts will literally see their taxable valuation double in a matter of 3 or 4 years as windmills come online.
Wow.
And of course, if you have new housing developments that are being built that are above and beyond just the normal growth of value of property, that's going to add to it too. Or if Microsoft or Facebook came in and built these huge buildings that they're doing in Des Moines area, that would also impact it. So this is just assuming that nothing fantastic happens, it's just sort of life continues on. So the other thing that we don't know is what kind of interest rates they're going to be. And this, of course, this is presuming that the bonds are being issued in 2019, which may or may not happen. So what I've used there is just sort of a flat average using 3.75%. Now today, if you had a voted bond issue that was approved and you were selling those bonds today, that rate would probably be somewhere around 3%. But we think interest rates are rising. They have been. The Federal Reserve's decision the other day does not have an immediate impact on this, but the tax bill that the House approved today and that the Senate is probably going to approve tonight will. Think of these bonds, remember, these are federally tax-exempt bonds. So whoever buys them, and it's usually banks or affluent people that are in a high tax bracket, because if you are in the highest bracket, if you're a bank, for example, and you're at 35% tax bracket, what that means is you don't pay 35% taxes on the interest. That's why the interest rate is so low. But if your tax bracket goes from 35% to 21%, which is what the tax plan is going to do, then all of a sudden you are only getting out of paying 21% instead of 35%. So a 3% interest rate doesn't mean nearly as much to you as it would have if you were in a higher tax bracket. So the interest rates are for municipal bonds, not necessarily all borrowing, but municipal bonds are almost certainly going to have to rise, and they might rise very quickly, very significantly. And my guess is that they might rise about 60 basis points. And the reason I'm saying, which is 0.6%. So if you were at 3, they go to 3.6. 5, they go to 5.6. The reason I say that is because about 3 to 4 weeks ago, we were taking proposals for sales tax bonds and general obligation bonds that other schools around Iowa were selling. And some of these large banks that buy these things began to put caveats in their proposals because they knew that this tax proposal was coming. So they said, well, we give you bid A, which is if the tax law never changes, then this is what our interest rate is. But then there's bid B, if the law changes, then your interest rate, meaning the school, your interest rate is automatically going to rise to make us whole so that we're earning the same equivalent yield that we would have. Well, the proposals we were seeing, it was taking about a 60 basis point difference to get the bank from point A to point B. Now, that's not a guarantee, doesn't mean it's absolutely going to happen, but it seems reasonable that it's going to. Even if that doesn't happen, interest rates have been rising. So this is 2 years or a year and a half into the future. Just the natural inclination of interest rates to rise could easily get you to 3.75. And they could go to 4 or 5. We don't know. That's one of the risks, is that we just don't know. But if this was accurate, you had 2% growth for 2 years and interest rates were still around 3.75 average. You see in the bottom there, this is where that $22 million figure comes from. So the good thing is that doesn't include if you wanted to presume you'd be issuing bonds over multiple years. And you almost certainly would be for a project this size. So for example, you probably would not issue $22 million of bonds all at once in the spring of 2019. You definitely could, and this is a decision for much later than tonight, but you could do that. For example, Johnston Schools did that. They issued $42 million all at once for 2 reasons. One, the school board thought interest rates were going to rise, and they just didn't want to risk them rising so much that it would cost them a lot more money. But more importantly, when they built their new high school, $80-some million high school, they needed more than $10 million throughout a few months period, so they couldn't mess around just issuing $10 million here and $10 million the next year. They had to issue significant amounts because they were going to blow that cash out very quickly. And with a project of this size, you're going to do something similar. But more than likely, you would probably issue 10 million in 1 year, and then probably the next year 12 million, or maybe the opposite. The reason for 10 million, which we don't need to get into too much tonight, but some of you may remember, is bank qualification. There's a specific reason to try to issue 10 million or less in a calendar year. You can't always do it. Johnston couldn't do it, for example, and it's okay. But if you can, there's a benefit to you to do it. And again, we're not going to talk much about it unless you want. But my point is, if you look at the next page, this particular example was that you would issue bonds in 2019 and then also issue in 2020. So you can see here, and you wouldn't literally issue just like this shows, like this is 22 million 1 year and then 800,000 the next. That wouldn't happen. But what this is doing is it's actually capturing 21 years of tax repayment. Each series of general obligation bonds can be outstanding for 20 years. But if you issue them in 2 consecutive years, you've actually captured 21 years of tax repayment. So what this is just showing is that you could probably, instead of 22.4 million as a bond issue amount, you could probably put on a ballot maybe 23.2 to 24. You could maybe put 25 million. Now, you wouldn't be guaranteed, and you wouldn't want to cut the architects loose on taking construction bids, because you don't know you could for sure get there. But if you could phase it in some way that if the math didn't work out over a 2 or 3 year period, you know that the greenhouse never gets built or whatever, something just doesn't happen, then that's okay. You could put a number that's larger. But it seems very reasonable that you could at least probably put this $23.2 to $23.5 million number on there, which actually then would give you, instead of 22 million, maybe close to 22.7 or 22.8 after you've assumed that there's some legal costs, et cetera. So that right there, and I'm not trying to say that so that these guys can go hog wild, but it might give you a little bit of flexibility there in some way or another. Now, we haven't gotten to this, and we will in just a second, but just know there's also a possibility that you could add $4 million to that number by renewing your voted PEPAL and then borrowing against it. So we'll see those numbers in just a minute, but just know that ultimately, and I'm not suggesting that you need to increase your project size at all, or that you need to borrow more money, but if you felt that you needed to, it's possible that you could get to probably $26.8-ish million by borrowing from a general obligation bond, which you see here, and borrowing from PEPAL. Now, whether you choose to borrow from PEPAL, of course, is another story, but we'll talk about it in a second. So then you skip past those 2 pages, and I'm just going to cover this real quick because I don't think you're going here. The page right before that one. Yep, right there. This is an option, but of course it's, for most people, a very undesirable option, and that is that you take your tax levy not to $2.70, but all the way to $4.05. It's legal to do this, but you have to have a second ballot question, which also requires 60%, and that second ballot question is basically asking your patrons to levy taxes at an even higher rate, above $2.70. I don't think this is where you want to go, but it's included here just for your information. You can see in the bottom left corner there, that might get you close to 33 million, of which you could also stagger it out and probably get to 34 to 35 million, plus the voted PEPAL borrowing, maybe 39 to 40 million. So that could be possible, but of course it would take a much higher tax rate. And knowing the history, at least in your district, although I think some things have changed significantly for the better, which is great, it's still extremely difficult to get that kind of thing passed. So the page after that shows you if you did have a $2.70 levy, and remember, just because the bond requires $2.70 doesn't necessarily mean you'd be levying $2.70, because you do have some flexibility in your management, cash reserve, etc. But if you needed to levy the whole $2.70, what you see on this worksheet on the next page there up on the screen is what would it cost a property owner that owns residential property, multi-residential property, commercial property, and agricultural land. So again, for those of you that have been on the board long enough, and for those of you in the audience that have been participating in public meetings for many years, we've talked about this before because you've had a bond election, and we talked about all these types of numbers. They're, of course, updated. And what you see here in the top section, just assuming, let's look at the $150,000 number. So this is saying if you have a residential home, that could be a house out in the country or it's a house in town, it doesn't matter, residential property is the same wherever you are, that's assessed at $150,000, that is not the market value, so that person's home might be able to be sold for 160 or 70, but it also may only be able to be sold for 140 or 130, depending on the condition and how much of your renovation the assessor knows about and all those kinds of things. But let's just assume your house is assessed at $150,000. You're not paying taxes on $150,000. You're paying taxes next fiscal year on 55.6% of that value. So that actually works out to be the $83,403 figure. And for most of the homes in Charles City Schools, it's that person's primary residence as opposed to a vacation house or a second home, etc. So you can claim homestead credit. You can also claim military credit if you're a military veteran. That's not even shown here because unfortunately for our veterans it's such a minimal amount it doesn't add up to anything, but it could reduce your taxes a little bit. So ultimately this $150,000 home is going to be taxed next year at $78,553. So when we're talking about property taxation, that would be 78,000s. We're always talking about $1,000 increments. So 78.553 times the $2.70 is about $212 per year or $17 per month. That would bring the school district $23 million of new something, whatever that might be. Commercial property is very similar, except there's only a 10% reduction, 10% rollback. And then agricultural land, there's a huge difference between perception and reality. So what you see in that little bottom section, the number $1,937, that is the actual average assessed value of 1 acre of farmland in Floyd County right now. So this is where you have to understand that this is not the market value. It's not the market value of any of those classes of property, but for ag land, it's very widely different. So if you own ag property, you might be able to sell that land for $6,000 or $8,000 or $10,000 or $12,000 an acre, depending on where you are in the state, quality of the land, etc. But you're not taxed at $6,000 or $8,000 or $10,000 or $12,000 an acre. If you owned an average acre in this county, it would be $1,937, but you're not even paying taxes on that amount because of this rollback calculation. So that would take your taxable value down to $1,055. And because we're talking about $1,000 increments, that becomes 1.055 times the $2.70 increase would be about $2.84 per year or 24 cents per month per acre. And then down below that, where that arrow's pointing to, it just shows you some examples. If you own 500 acres of average land and the school district, and by the way, this works for the county, the community college, the city, although the farm wouldn't be in the city, any municipality, this all is the same. It just depends on what the value of property is and how much that municipality is going to raise your taxes. But if you own 500 acres, that would be costing you about $1,423 per year to get the school district $22 million of something. And then if you, of course, the house would be separate. For those people that live in the farm, they own ag land, but they also own a house, so there's two calculations there. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So that becomes really critical when you start talking about, can our community afford this? And what you find, I think, most of the time is that it's much more affordable than most people think. That doesn't mean that you should go out and borrow as much as you can. It doesn't mean the project is good. I don't have any opinions about that stuff. That's local decision. But if you just look at the simple math, and people can actually understand it, which unfortunately is the problem, very few people are going to come to this meeting or come to your other meetings or listen to what's being said, but this is the truth. The only thing that's going to change from one year to the next is the value of your property and eventually the rollback. The rollback does change every year, but it doesn't change a lot from one year to the next. So the next page just shows you what $4.05 would cost. We're going to skip that. And then we're going to come to what I've called scenario A. This is where we talk about the PEPAL, borrowing from the voted PEPAL. So your current PEPAL right now expires in fiscal year 30, actually. You just renewed it recently. So you can go out and borrow against it right now if you wanted to. You have the authority to do that. Right now you could do that. This particular worksheet, however, assumes you don't do it until the spring of 2020. That's when your other debt that you already have is gone, and you basically have a clean slate, and it doesn't seem like you need to borrow from it anyway right now, because this is a project that's kind of in the beginning stages. So this is showing you, if you borrowed against the PEPAL the most you possibly could, and didn't care about what happened to your ability to buy buses and technology and maintenance. So this is not going to happen. You'll see on the next page. This is just telling you what could happen. So you see here in that second from the right column, so on the next page of the one up on the screen, that the payment is not exceeding roughly $680,000. That's because your ballot language for your voted PEPAL requires you to levy some portion of that tax as income surtax. And you can't levy less than 1%. You must levy income surtax in 1% increments if you have to levy it at all, and you do, because your ballot suggested that you would, and that's what the voters approved. So in that little box up above in the yellow thing, that what we find is that if you only levied 1% surtax, and I don't remember what you're levying right now, Terry, is it 1? Okay, so it wouldn't be really any change from what you're doing right now. That currently equates to $89,000, so that's a tax that's calculated off the amount of income tax, state income tax, all the people in your district pay. So that $89,000 can't be obligated to a debt. That's against the law in Iowa. You can only borrow against property tax authority or sales tax now. So what that's showing is that your maximum payment could not exceed $682,000. So that's where this is coming from. You see in the bottom left corner here that you could probably fund around $5.7 million. But you really are not going to do that. Going to the next page, this is, and this is very small, it's impossible for you guys in the audience to see this. This is, for those of you that have seen me before, this is what I call a checkbook register. Very simple. It's money coming in, money going out, and balance at the end, just like your checkbook register at home. We began in the far right column with $2,007,000 in June. That's what Terry told me your cash balances were. So from that point, we start adding sales tax revenue, we start adding voted PEPAL, adding board PEPAL revenue, we start subtracting money. So that's money to pay the bonds you already have and the bonds that you might have in 2020. This is assuming that the $5 million PEPAL issuance that we just looked at actually happened. You can see that there's other things in here. We're assuming that you are also reserving money for ongoing needs. That's kind of in the middle, $692,000 in 18, $844,000 in the next year, and then it starts to just go off of an inflated assumption. And we are also reserving $500,000 for the athletic complex that we assume is going to happen this summer. But you see, if you look along the far right column, which is then the checkbook balance, all things are great until you get to 2023. And some of you might say, well, I'm not going to be on the board by then anyway, so I don't care what happens. But that better not be your attitude, because what you see here is that then you start to have very significant deficits. And those deficits are long-term. They go on for a couple years. Now, you could tell me, well, we're not going to spend $800,000+ every year on buses and technology and just general maintenance. If you told me that, we would lower that number, and that could allow you to borrow that whole amount. But we've had this discussion for years at this school district about how much should be reserved, and I believe this number, although it might be a little bit conservative, I think this is close to the number that your community wants to see in there. Now, I could be wrong, I don't live here, but if you as board members want to change it, great. But what you see, those deficit balances tell us you could not borrow to that limit with PEPAL. So you go to the next section, which is section B, and now this is the same borrowing, or the same concept, but now the borrowing's reduced such that your overall cash balance in that checkbook register never drops below $700,000. So there's always a cushion in there for an emergency or extra buses that you didn't plan on, whatever, something that comes up that you just didn't anticipate. Plus, there's obviously positive balances. There are no negative balances. You're always at $700,000 or above. So now you see in the bottom left corner here that might produce around $4.1 to $4.2 million. Again, it's going to be dependent on interest rates and your property value, but it's hopefully going to be close to that. So if the board wanted to do that, that's where that $4 million figure came that I said you could add to the 22 or 23 to get to maybe 26 or 27 if you wanted to. Now, it's important to know, if you did that, and this isn't meant to say you shouldn't, this is your local decision, is your prerogative. If you did that, you would literally have no borrowing capacity from any source for many, many years. You would have consumed your sales tax revenue, which you've already done for the most part. You would have consumed your ability to borrow from PEPAL, and you would have consumed the $2.70. Now, yes, you could come back and ask for $4.05. That's possible, but it seems very unlikely that that's really going to happen. So if you borrowed from the voted PEPAL like this and roughly $22 million from GO bonds, that has to pretty much cover this district as far as major infrastructure needs for probably a decade or more. And if that's the case, then that's perfectly fine. But if that scares you and you think, well, no, there's another phase 3 and a phase 4 that we need to do, then maybe you hold off and you don't borrow from the voted PEPAL, and you truly limit yourself to this $22 million to $23 million number. Does that make sense? So any other questions about the numbers that are in there, or the voting process, the referendum process that we kind of skipped over in those first few pages?
The last scenario just shows an accumulation of that.
Yep, that's correct.
That money.
So the last one is just showing you borrowing from PEPAL, but at the lower level, still paying the sales tax bonds that you already owe money on, and still paying for all of the general stuff year after year after year. And that suggests that you might have roughly $7.3 million extra over the next 12 years. Now, remember that the gist of this was that your balance didn't go below $700,000 at any one time. And in this particular instance, it actually doesn't go below $800,000, so you could maybe borrow a little bit more. And of course, as we get closer and closer to you really doing something, if you really do something, we would update interest rates and all that and see what the number really is. But it's in this ballpark.
Excellent. Comments, questions for Matt?
Lots of review.
Yeah,
Yes.
lots to take in, yeah. For those
So
that
the
first time,
process,
it's,
just real quick, if I mentioned the voting process, those 2 dates that would be very important if you want to begin something in the spring of 19. Regarding the PEPAL, there is no process that you have to follow as far as voting, because there's no more voting. You have the authority. You could go out today and borrow, but you just couldn't borrow as much. Just like the sales tax that had that 1.2 limit, your existing PEPAL debt is already taking you close to the limit. So just because you have 10 new years doesn't give you any ability right now to borrow more. But once you get to 2020, when all of your existing debt's gone, then you have an open, clean slate, and that's where you could get that up to $5 million figure. And that's just the board saying we want to do it. Takes about 6 to 8 weeks, and the money's just sitting in your bank. Of course, the voted bond is much more onerous, that process. Lots of community meetings, lots of community input. Ultimately, voting, obviously, 60% approval. 60% of the people that show up, not 60% of eligible voters. So if you have 100 people that vote, you need 60 of them to vote yes.
good. Any
Other questions?
Questions, no comments? Lots to take in, Matt. I
Okay.
always appreciate this
You
kind of
bet.
stuff. It's, it is a lot to sit down and look through, like you said, with this, but it's incredibly important for us.
If you do have questions, you want me to adjust any of the assumptions or the timing, just let the business manager know, and Terry and I can work it out, and I can send you back revisions in a matter of a couple hours, usually, unless I'm out here traveling somewhere. But
Sure.
usually you can get that stuff turned around pretty quickly if you need it. All right?
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
you.
Matt.
At this time, I'll ask if there's anyone that would like to make public comment or ask questions regarding this specific agenda item. Nope. Thank you, Matt. We appreciate you coming up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This time, we'll move on to agenda item number 7, North Grand Building option and the next steps. Dr. Cox.
So December 12th came and went. The option was not exercised by Charlie Thompson to purchase the North Grand Building, so now the option has expired and it's the board's turn to decide how we want to proceed ahead. As we heard from Jean earlier, if we relocate the students for a year to that building, obviously the construction goes a lot quicker. So my recommendation is that we don't extend the option that was on the table, but that we pursue some other developers. It's a big project. And if there is somebody who wants to come in and do that, that we take that path instead. Otherwise, we keep the North Grand building as a place for us to relocate. We're potentially looking at the 1920 school year, and that would make a much more cost-effective way than paying to bring in a whole bunch of portables and put them out here. It's much less disruptive to the education of our students if we can utilize a space that is a school for the purpose of being a school one more year.
Comments, questions for board members?
Fallon, I see you shaking your head. Mick, as a student, and you know what portables are like, I mean, you could assume I've seen you at other districts, and what would your thoughts be on that?
I think like relocating us is a more better option because then we're actually in a classroom environment and not like in a portable room that we're not used to all the time. And I've had students like ask what we're gonna do if they continue this. So it's good input that I can give back to them.
Do you feel like there would be student support for that type of a situation?
Yeah.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Excellent.
Probably be something like the transportation, the old transportation building, on the college grounds, you know, 10, 15, 20 of them somewhere. Some of us actually went through first and second and third grade in those types of buildings after the tornado and other grades.
You're talking portables?
Portables, yeah, would be something, and I'm just using that as an example. There's a building at College
The white
grounds.
building.
The white building, yes, that used to be Title I at IC, and we moved it over there. I mean, think of 20 of those, or 10, twice the size somewhere, and you have to go out every time to go to a different classroom. And if we can save how many ever tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in buying or renting those and moving students to 500 North Grand for a year or more, yeah, I think that makes much more sense. But I just wanted to give you a concept or a visual. And that makes sense then? Yeah, okay.
Josh, Rob, anything else? Let me see. I agree, you know, this is something that we've talked a lot about here more recently as being an option, and as I stated earlier with the proposal from BLDD is that I think it's just critical that we do everything we can to get it right, to get the new building right and the renovation right, and make no concessions in that process simply because we have kids that we need to educate during that construction period of time. And, you know, hearing the student perspective helps. Having seen the estimated cost previously for portables were, you know, a shocker, you know, and if memory serves, $500,000 to $1 million simply in costs of portables to house kids in for a year, or 18 months or whatever period of time that would be. That's money that you take away from your project to put simply into that. And I think that when we have this option potentially available, that's going to be really important in this process. Terry, I know you've looked at where we're at with annual utilities, you know, simply the utilities on the North Grand building. Can you give us a number, ballpark number? I've got it before, but.
The North Grand building for utilities was $48,000 approximately for the water, electricity, gas, and we're spending probably $11,000 for custodial and another $24,000 for insurance on the building, which we currently have replacement value on the building.
Terry, was that?
So that brings it up to about 83.6 is the annual cost.
So 48,000 per month or per
No,
year?
year.
Okay, just want to make sure we clarify that.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And that was fully occupied, or that's what it is today?
That's what it was in 16, 17 when it wasn't fully occupied.
Okay. Would we anticipate using all of the space?
Yes.
So all the classrooms would be brought up to classroom and used and,
They-
yeah, I mean, just take the stuff out.
Turn the lights back
Yeah,
on,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yep.
Open the doors back up, air it out a little bit, and the kids will know their way around. It'll be familiar area.
But you'd go for a year or two with no utilities in the 3 circles here. And you'd have utilities down there again where your students are.
Well, we still come, and like we just talked, we were looking at upwards of $1 million for rental. Those utility costs will not reach. those
Absolutely
numbers.
not.
And just, as Fallon said, just knowing that they're gonna be learning in an environment that is a school as opposed to these pods, which is disconnected, there's no familiarity there, they're not set up to be learning environments. We can make do with what we have.
Excellent. Thanks, Terry. Any further comments, discussion? At this time, I'll ask for public comment. I'll remind you that the policies and procedures outlined in Agenda Item 4 will apply here. You will be asked to keep your comments to 2 minutes, which I will try and keep on my phone. Does anyone wish to make public comment? Go ahead, Jerry. Yep, come on up to the microphone, state your name and where you're from.
I'm Jerry Yeager from Charles City. First of all, Dr. Cox, when you said the 2020 year, is that the 2019-20 year that you would anticipate occupying the middle school?
I would anticipate 1920 as the year, yes.
School year.
Potentially the spring semester of 2019, but certainly the 2019-2020 school year.
Just from what little I know about this and followed you, it makes a lot of sense to do that versus trying to stay here and work around. As Robin mentioned, it appears right now you're gonna have that middle school, the old middle school cost anyway. It may be a little higher if you move students down there, but you're gonna save some up here. So it would make a lot of good sense that you would consolidate that into 500 North Grand for that period of time. Also, I might like to express that we, the community, school and everybody, work real hard to find a proper, good community use for that building and that property for 2021 and thereafter. And I think I can say the city is more than willing to work with you on that, but we really need to get after that because I don't want to see us ending up where we are right now. We got a big building and nothing in it.
Right.
And no potential, but if we can buy a year out of it and save you some operating costs by consolidating, that'd be great.
Excellent.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Jerry.
Thanks, Jerry.
Any further comments?
My name is Ann Benning. I live here in Charles City. My question is there a cost to bring the old middle school, the North Grand building, up to code? Is there additional cost that's there that we have to put into before students can move in?
There shouldn't be. It hasn't stopped
Okay.
being an educational space. Our Iowa Big North program is there. Carrie Lane Alternative School is still there. The homeschool assistance program is still there, so.
Okay.
And we still utilize the auditorium, so there
Okay.
should not be any change.
Major expense. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ann. Anything additional? Thank you all. Appreciate that. Final comments on that agenda item by board members?
I look forward to moving forward.
Excellent. Well, we will move on to agenda item 8, which is adjournment. So thank you all for coming. We greatly appreciate your attendance.